Before I introduce Jim, I should just say that we have got time for questions, and this is a very rare opportunity, I think, for you to ask questions about a critically important topic of the people who are best placed to give you answers. So be ready, because I'm sure we'll eventually run out of time. So to introduce Jim to the few of you probably who don't know him, Jim was the Director of Public Transport in Victoria before then serving as the Secretary of the Department of Transport from 2008 to 2013. Among many notable achievements was the Transport Integration Act, which I was fortunate to contribute to, and the progressive modernisation and transformation of our public transport system, guided by the Victorian Transport Plan. Jim was subsequently appointed as the CEO of Infrastructure New South Wales. After 6 years, he was then appointed in April this year as the Secretary of the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. As we mentioned earlier, Jim spoke at very short notice at our 40th anniversary. He sat on the edge of the stage with his sleeves rolled up in typical Jim fashion and spoke more or less off the cuff. And we're delighted that he can be with us today, if only by video. I noted that soon after he recorded this, he left the country, but I want to assure you those two things are not causally related. So with no further ado, we will listen to Jim.
Hi there, my name's Jim Betts, and some of you might remember me from such escapades as being the Secretary of the Victorian Transport Department between 2008 and 2013. And I want to begin by saying happy 50th birthday to the crew at Monash Uni Transport. You have been an amazing influential force for generations of transport planners, transport operators, transport officials, transport mandarins over now 5 decades, and that's a fantastic achievement. I think perhaps one of the reasons that you've asked me to have a chat today is because I gave the 40th anniversary Ogden lecture. At the time I was a callow 44-year-old, just a kid with a crazy dream. And I seem to remember sitting there rather like I am today, slightly thinner, slightly less bald, and sitting on the edge of the stage, probably had a cigarette and an ashtray, and I was pinch hitting for somebody else, as I recall, and I ran through 10 propositions about the transport system. And hopefully that provoked a little bit of debate at the time. I think at the time I'd been Secretary of the Victorian Transport Department for about 18 months, and prior to that I'd been Director of Public Transport. I should say, by the way, I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person for this important event. Both of my parents are turning 80 this year, and I'm currently in what's left of the UK, whatever Boris Johnson has left of the UK, celebrating that birthday with them. Otherwise I'd definitely have been there in person. So let's go back to 2009, which was an interesting, pivotal moment in the history of the Victorian transport system. And at that time, I'd become Secretary 18 months earlier, and we were working on the production of the Transport Integration Act, which I still think has stood its ground as a very decent piece of contemporary legislation for Victoria. And we were in the process of completing the Victorian Transport Plan, which is still being rolled out now with projects like Metro. Fantastic projects which I'm really proud of, and obviously we've had regional rail links since then. I talked at the time about 10 propositions, and I'm only going to bore you with 8 today, given that time is relatively tight. But I want to fast forward to the end of my stint in Victoria, which occurred on the 9th of April 2013, which was also the day on which Margaret Thatcher died. It was the day after I had presented Cabinet with the business case for the famous East-West motorway link, benefit cost ratio 0.45. By 8:30 the following morning, I'd left the building. But I was lucky, I fell on my feet, and I came to beautiful Sydney, where since that time for 6 years I ran Infrastructure New South Wales, which is the government's key advisory body here, setting the priorities for infrastructure investment. And more recently, I've stepped into the role since April of being Secretary of the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. So really in the last 10 years, I've gone from transport specialist through to a broader infrastructure position, looking at social infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, as well as transport, which remains a big part of the picture in New South Wales. 70% of capital spend is on transport. And then in the last few months, I've started adjusting to life as a land use planner. And that's been a very interesting cultural journey. I've found that whereas in the infrastructure or transport sector, if you don't deliver a project on time, you lose your job. In the world of planning, things can disappear off the radar for 6 months and there are no consequences. It's an interesting cultural challenge. I think when I go back to the propositions that I articulated or attempted to articulate 10 years ago, first and foremost among them was the proposition that transport planning and land use planning are the same thing. They're not just closely related, they are the same thing. You can't plan your transport system unless you know where people are going to live and where people are going to work, because that determines the demand for travel. It therefore determines the stresses which get placed on the transport system and therefore where you need to target your interventions, regulatory or investment interventions. And conversely, if you flip it round, you can try to shape the urban form in a sustainable way by constraining people with the rules and regulations of the planning system, but by far the most effective way of shaping the urban form and shaping the distribution of population is the enabling kicker that comes from high quality transport infrastructure. So proposition one, transport planning and land use planning are the same thing, and nothing that I've seen in the intervening 10 years has challenged that proposition. And in fact, we have seen the urban form transformed as a result of some of the investments which we were undertaking 10 years ago in Victoria, and that's very much the story here in Sydney as well. Second proposition is that transport is not an end in itself. So one of the great successes that we've had in Sydney in recent times is actually to establish land use as the lead. So through the work of the Greater Sydney Commission, we've articulated a vision for Sydney and a vision for our key regional centres about the shape that those should take, where the population will be located, the balance in land use between parkland, industrial, residential, mixed-use development, where our population is going to be as it grows over the next 10, 20, 30 years by 1.7 million people. We've developed the concept of 3 distinct cities within the Sydney metropolis, in the eastern city around the harbour, the central city around Parramatta, and the western city around the new airport. And all of the agencies across government in infrastructure, including transport, are now organising their forward capital plans in order to support that land use-led vision for the city, that economic development and jobs-led vision for the city. And that has been a transformational breakthrough, but it has given us the spatial directions around which we can organise. And if governments don't put in place very strong economic development plans and land use plans with a strong spatial component, then transport is flying blind in its own planning. That's proposition number 2. Proposition number 3 is that good projects come from good plans. And conversely, bad projects come from a lack of planning. So when I go back 10 years or more to the Victorian Transport Plan, it wasn't perfect by any stretch, but it was the first time that we'd had a real crack at having an integrated and joined up approach between transport and land use. And as I said before, many of the projects which are in that plan are still being rolled out today. I don't see an equivalent of the Victorian Transport Plan in existence today. It may be that the projects that the government in Victoria is rolling out are the best projects, but you wouldn't know because you don't have a plan within which to operate. You do have an independent infrastructure advisory body, but there doesn't seem to be a strong correlation between its very well-founded, researched, evidence-based conclusions and the investment priorities articulated by the Victorian government. We are not perfect in Sydney, but all of our major transport projects are traceable back to comprehensive, integrated land use and transport plans. We're in Sydney now where Victoria was 10 years ago. Where's Victoria at? I think partly, and this is my 4th proposition, good governments do plan ahead for the long term. Jeff Kennett had his detractors. I'm probably one of them in many ways, but he did say that you're not a good government unless you plan 50 years into the future. And I think we're all products of the political environment in which we've operated. And for a very long period of time, from 2010 really through to the most recent election in Victoria, the government of the day has been on a political knife edge. And when you're on a political knife edge, you're grasping for the next popular project, the next ribbon that can be cut, the next media release that can be issued. Whereas when you have confidence and capacity and the expectation of being in power for 2 or 3 terms, which the coalition government has had in New South Wales, you know that you're going to be around long enough, in all likelihood, for your short-termism to bite you on the bum. And you know, therefore, that it's in your interest to plan ahead, and that in the long term, good policy is good politics, and that's certainly what we've had here. But I think back to my time in Victoria, and I reflect that the first half-decent transport plan produced by the very good Bracks-Brumby government was meeting our transport challenges in 2006, i.e. 7 years into a Labor government's term in office. And the Victorian Transport Plan didn't come out until the end of 2008, which was 9 years. And then I reflect on the constant crisis management which occurred during the course of 2009 going into 2010, where we had the right projects, but we hadn't planned sufficiently far ahead. So as patronage on the rail system ballooned, we couldn't run fast enough to keep up with the demand that was being placed on the train system. We had the very hot summer of 2009, and it felt like an atmosphere of crisis management. You remember that trains were due to arrive one a month, and every time a train was 2 days late, it was on the front page of The Age. That kind of stuff doesn't happen if you plan decently ahead of time. So there's a lesson in there for all of us. Good governments plan ahead. The fifth proposition I want to put on the table is that the transport business is the placemaking business. Movement and place, that framework which is now increasingly in vogue, is really important. And when we think about some of the worst aspects of our transport system, we think about arterial roads that are neither one thing or another, whether it's Hoddle Street in Melbourne or it's Parramatta Road or Military Road in Sydney. We have the worst of movement and place. We have roads which are not fit for purpose in terms of arterial road movements, and they are also very unpleasant places to live and to run your business. So embedding excellence in urban design into our transport planning is absolutely critical, and I think the community is leading us in this direction anyway, where at-grade motorways are no longer likely to receive a social licence from government, which is why motorways are becoming increasingly expensive. They're largely underground, at least in Sydney, and we are approaching the point where we have an end state for our motorway network in both of our major capital cities. And that can be a good thing if we're taking cars off the surface and putting them in tunnels, but it does require governments to have the political courage to aggressively repurpose road space to favour active transport, to favour public transport, and to favour the greening and rehabilitation and civilisation of our inner city streets as we invest in the motorway network. The sixth proposition is that it's all about the iceberg, not about the tip. In other words, we focus very much on glamorous new capital investment and politicians cutting ribbons, as I mentioned before, but the installed asset base already exists. And I remember talking to Ken Ogden 10 years ago when we went for a drink after the lecture, and I had posited that 90% of the infrastructure that Melbourne would need in 2040 existed in 2009. We had a debate about whether it was 85% or 90%. But the key thing is that land use is constrained, the fiscal environment is constrained. The big challenges are about how we get maximum usage and how we optimise the management of assets which already exist. And that's where technology is capable of either unleashing a utopia or a dystopia, depending on how it's regulated and how it's introduced. But there is the capacity there to get much better value out of existing transport infrastructure through improved pricing regulation and other allocation principles. I want to reflect on independent bodies and their role in decision making. When I stepped into the planning portfolio in New South Wales, I was struck by the proliferation of independent agencies, advisory bodies, regulators. And you're left wondering when you see all these independent bodies, what does that reflect? Does it reflect perhaps a lack of competence in the mainstream bureaucracy? Does it reflect a lack of confidence in that bureaucracy, or does it reflect a lack of legitimacy in the bureaucracy in the eyes of the community? These are questions which are worth interrogating. But we've seen the proliferation of so-called I bodies, infrastructure bodies across Australia, starting with Infrastructure Australia, Infrastructure New South Wales, Infrastructure Victoria. It's spread west, it's spread south, it's spread north. And all of these bodies are different, and they all have their own rules, this being Australia, and they all respond to different traumas in the history of the jurisdiction which they serve. But Infrastructure Victoria, it seems to me, has done a terrific job in response to the great trauma of the politically polarising events around the East-West link, which I referred to earlier. And the best thing that the Victorian government could do is listen to Michel Masson and his team and take on board the advice that they provide. New South Wales, in contrast, as CEO of Infrastructure New South Wales, I was in the cabinet room, I was taking the decisions alongside ministers, I was providing the independent critique within the room, within government. If I had a choice between independence and influence, I would always choose influence, because independence without influence is impotence. Final proposition, we're in the home stretch now. The Commonwealth has lost the plot in transport. It's a long time since the Commonwealth seriously engaged with anything in our major cities. To the extent that they do, it tends to be publicity stunts around airport rail links. But we badly need the Commonwealth looking after our cities, investing in our cities, making them function. The Australian economy can't function unless Melbourne and Sydney are functioning, and Melbourne and Sydney rely on their transport systems in order to function efficiently and effectively. And we also need a national freight and logistics strategy. And if the Commonwealth isn't prepared to adopt such a strategy, then we run the risk that politically popular projects like the Inland Rail Link will consume all the available scarce capital, and huge amounts of value will be left on our table, not least for our primary producers in regional areas, who potentially are the biggest losers from the Commonwealth's failure adequately to order its investment priorities. But the irony is that now in Victoria, the whole script has flipped. So 10 years ago, in the period that I'm lionising, when we had the Victorian Transport Plan and everything was great, we were struggling for every single investment dollar we could get. There'd been no serious investment in public transport in Victoria since 1982 with the opening of the Melbourne Underground Rail Loop, which added nothing to the capacity of the aggregate rail system. It certainly relieved pressure on Flinders Street, but it merely distributed people more efficiently around the centre of the city, which is a good thing, but it didn't augment the capacity of the trunk rail system. So public transport had been starved of cash for so long that generations of people had gone through the system and scrimped and saved every dollar just to keep the show on the road with band-aids. Now we fast forward to 2019 and we can see massive investments in public transport by governments across the political spectrum in both Victoria and in New South Wales. And I guess the challenge for all of us is to make sure that now that the dollars are flowing, and with our populations growing rapidly, 120,000 people a year, that investment needs to continue to flow, that we don't look back on this era as one in which we invested large amounts of money, but in the wrong things, because we hadn't invested up front in good, rigorous long-term planning. But I know as you approach your 50th birthday, your 50th anniversary, as you're celebrating it tonight, that Monash Uni has done nothing but been on the good side as we've battled to get decent transport policy, decent transport planning and decent transport legislation in place in Victoria over generations now. So I want to end by once again congratulating Michael Kennedy and Jeff Rose and all of the team at Monash Uni, and I'm hoping you have a great night. Thanks.
I'll be sure to send Jim a text and tell him that you gave him a clap. He'll be most appreciative. A vigorous clap, absolutely. I've already sent him a photo of him on the screen and said that him 10 times life size was truly scary, but that's another thing altogether. Let me introduce Romilly Maju AO, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Infrastructure Australia. Looking ahead at a time of extraordinary economic, social, technological and environmental challenge, to predict how Australia should address those challenges is what Romilly and her organisation does on a daily basis. To quote one recent publication, this has to be one of the toughest gigs in town. A lightning rod for all the political flack you can think of. The city's agenda, transport, congestion, population, energy, water, telecommunications, to name just a few. Add for good measure the pressure from growing environmental challenges and the social issues all of the above will engender. Sounds pretty right to me. Romilly has come to her role from an ideal background after successfully leading the Green Building Council of Australia for 13 years. Romilly is recognised internationally as a leader and advocate for change in the property and construction sector. Her achievements have been recognised with national and international awards, including the 2017 World Green Building Council Chairman's Award and the 2015 International Leadership Award from the US Green Building Council. Romilly was awarded an Officer of the Order of Australia in recognition of her distinguished service to the construction sector as a change agent and advocate for sustainable building practices. Romilly is also a member of the Federal Government's Cities Reference Group and the National Sustainable Development Council. Over to you.
Thank you. I thought it was... that after Jim's 8 propositions and the 8th being on federal government, that I and them follow Jim. So I will make sure to send him a text to thank him for that segue. Congratulations as well. I also want to say it's wonderful for the 50-year anniversary of the Monash transport program. It's incredibly important that academia, we learn so much from academia in all the work that you have done, and it falls into the audit that I'm going to talk about. I'll give you some, a little snippet of the references that was involved. I also think it's particularly important that I'm sitting here with the inaugural chair of Infrastructure Australia, Sir Rod Eddington. Infrastructure Australia was created in 2008 and then went through a change in 2014. But it was the first of its kind globally. There was nothing like it, and a number of countries now have I-bodies, infrastructure bodies, and no other country has the infrastructure governance we currently have, with every state in Australia now having an I-body. So I think I don't think you should underestimate the influence that Sir Rod has had in driving that change in infrastructure governance, because while we're challenged when it comes to overcrowding and congestion, we are in a good place when it comes to governance. And I do think it's appropriate that I follow Jim Betts, being that New South Wales was the second I-body, and Jim is a force to be reckoned with. He has done... He doesn't shy away, and he's a very frank person from his views. But again, because of that, I think we're in a very good place. And I think in the department that he's in, known as PI, Planning, Industry and Environment, that he'll do some wonderful things. I started my role after 13 years at Green Building Council in April this year, so I've been in the role for 5 months. But in my role at Green Building Council, have worked closely with Infrastructure Australia over the 11 years. I'll just paint you a picture of who we are, because as Jim said, all the I-bodies are quite different. So Infrastructure Australia is the federal government's independent advisor on infrastructure, and we report through the Deputy Prime Minister. But we also now, interestingly enough, have 2 cabinet ministers, which is just to show you the importance that infrastructure is playing out at the moment. Our other cabinet minister is Minister Tudge, who's from here down in Victoria, and he's the urban minister, and he also focuses on cities and population and housing. So we have 2 ministers in cabinet. The 2 major roles that we play, the first one is we evaluate business cases from jurisdictions specifically seeking over $100 million from federal government in funding. From there, we also create the infrastructure priority list known as the pipeline. And there's 130 projects currently on the pipeline, and 103 of them are just initiatives, so they're underfunded projects, and 27 are projects that have gone through to that business case stage. The pipeline is really important because it puts discipline, and Sir Rod and I were talking about this before, it puts discipline into the jurisdictions to actually have to do planning, which Jim talked about, the importance of thinking about the project. Is it nationally significant? Is it solving a problem? We don't just put projects on the pipeline, we triage the proposals when they come through. And we need to release the pipeline, the IPL, every year. It's a live document, but we update it every year. And just to give you a sense of the importance of infrastructure at the moment, we currently have 200 new proposals from jurisdictions, local governments and non-government agencies, and we haven't finished. So we're likely to get 250 this year alone that we will have to consider, and we do triage those that go through. The other thing that we do that's incredibly important is we set the agenda on long-term opportunities for infrastructure reform needed to ensure Australia's economic prosperity and quality of life. And in thinking about tonight's theme about looking forward, it's really timely that this evening that we're talking about that. With the view of infrastructure challenges ahead, we have just released the Australian Infrastructure Audit, the second of our audits, and it very much is looking ahead, and its focus is very much on that. It was released last month, and if you haven't seen it, before you download the 642 pages, I suggest you download the 85-page executive summary because it helps navigate the 642 pages. And there's also addendums as well, which I will talk about. So the audit is best seen as an evidence base to guide future investment and reform, and it spans across Australia's major infrastructure sectors. So it looks at transport, both passenger and freight, telecommunications, water and energy. And this year for the first time, so we did our original audit in 2015, but this year for the first time we also include social infrastructure and waste. And social infrastructure, we look at green and blue infrastructure, housing, justice, culture, and other areas. So it's an important focus this year is on that as well. And one of the main themes of the 2019 audit is that it's a particularly important time for Australian infrastructure planning and decision making because we are facing a period of unique uncertainty. We're experiencing a changing climate, a reordering of the world economy and reshaping of global institutions and norms, and that really has been playing out over the last couple of weeks. Closer to home, our population is growing. We have the fastest population growth rate in the OECD, and the structure of our economy is shifting and has been mentioned tonight. Technological change is fundamentally reshaping our day-to-day lives. All of these trends will have a flow-on effect to the way we plan and deliver our infrastructure. In particular, our growing, ageing and urbanising population has immediate implications for infrastructure demand. And Australia is set to grow by 24% over the next 15 years. And 3/4 of that growth will occur in our 4 fastest growing cities, being Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Perth. Since the last audit in 2015, Melbourne's population forecast has increased by a further 4%. And the number of people expected to be living in Port Phillip, Melbourne City, Maribyrnong and Yarra has increased, while outer areas such as Casey are also projected to have higher populations. Population growth can offer enormous economic opportunities, but the risk is that our infrastructure fails to keep pace with demand, impacting productivity, quality of life and livability outcomes. Congestion on our roads presents an annual cost currently to the economy of $19 billion. Without added investment, over and above what has already been committed to this, the cost is predicted by 2031 to double without investment. Melbourne's road and public transport congestion will worsen by around 15%. Importantly too, urban transport faces a range of challenges which are not limited to congestion. Ageing and straining road and rail networks, rapidly changing trends in travel habits and land use have all significant effects upon the long-term viability of our transport assets. The predicted rise of electric, connected and automated vehicles over the coming years could add pressure to our energy, transport and telecommunications infrastructure. However, these technological developments also present an opportunity to improve our planning and traffic flows, as well as having positive impacts on road safety and emissions reductions. In light of these trends, the headline message that emerges from the audit is that Australia's infrastructure program must do more than plug the immediate funding gap. Rather than short-term boom, we believe the historic level of activity we are currently seeing in the sector is the new normal. And it must continue for at least the next 15 years and beyond. If we look at project commitments in the short and medium term pipeline, as well as major long-term commitments that haven't yet been funded, we think this level of activity is likely to and will in fact need to stay elevated for more than a decade. Many of these long-term commitments, particularly urban rail enhancements, such as the outer suburban rail link in Melbourne, Metronet in Perth and metro expansions in Sydney, will be delivered over many years, potentially a decade. Queensland's long-term outlook is also strong, continued investment, while short to medium-term enhancements to the Bruce Highway and M1 Pacific motorway will continue. Here in Melbourne, one of the fastest growing cities in the developed world, and Sir Rod and I were at the IPA conference last week, and there was a little bit of a competition going on between the New South Wales and Victoria treasurers, I should say, around livability in fast-growing cities. You can imagine your treasurer was saying we all should move from New South Wales to Victoria. We're certainly seeing investment in large-scale projects to increase capacity on the city's road and rail networks. Melbourne is home, and this is, I think, a really interesting point. Melbourne is home to the biggest mega projects, so mega projects are projects over $1 billion, including Stage 2 of the Monash Freeway upgrade, Melbourne Metro and North East Link, all of which have been highlighted as nationally significant investments in the infrastructure priority list. Sustaining this level of investment over the next 15 years will be important, but growing demand and uncertainty will mean continued focus on reform is required. It's not just about large projects and spending commitments. It's also about striving for best practice, and this Jim has said the same thing, best practice across planning, resourcing, procurement and contracting to better accommodate this sustained level of activity. While we are seeing record levels of infrastructure investment across the country to meet future demand, a key challenge we identify in the audit is the need to deepen community engagement in infrastructure decision making and delivery. Establishing genuine community buy-in, whether for infrastructure investment or long-term reform, needs to be a priority for both government and industry. Our audit found that government and operator engagement with customers and the broader community on project and operation decisions can be improved across most sectors and jurisdictions. And of course, failure to engage can carry substantial costs. For example, it's estimated that around $2 billion worth of infrastructure projects were delayed, cancelled or mothballed due to community opposition over the past decade. Added to this, our research found that 4 in 5 Australians believe it's extremely or very important to consider the views of the community when planning and investing in major infrastructure. This focus on ensuring community feels heard is increasingly important as infrastructure projects are getting larger and more complex. Too often engagement is carried out too late in the process. When infrastructure does not align with desired community outcomes, it can come at a great cost to the projects. One opportunity highlighted in the audit is that access to more data, and again that's been talked about today, on current and potential users may enable more rigorous analysis of future demand, which would assist in developing projects that properly address identified infrastructure gap. However, better data does not replace the need for engagement. Rather, enhancements in information on users should enable governments and industry to engage more deeply with the most relevant stakeholders. Over time, this may make it easier to ask the right people the right questions to develop a targeted approach to delivering infrastructure, and to explain that sometimes difficult policy and spending trade-offs that are inevitable in infrastructure decisions. I've only skimmed on the surface of the 180 challenges and opportunities we identified in the audit. I would strongly encourage you to try and read the 642 pages. There are 150 contributors and there's 2,500 references in the audit. One of the things I think that's important to note about the audit is we don't take a jurisdictional lens, we take a geographic lens. So we look at fast-growing cities, we then look at smaller cities and regional centres, small towns, rural communities and remote areas, and developing regions in Northern Australia. And then over the top of that, we take a community-centred approach, looking at access, quality and cost. So I know it's not a transport example I'm about to give you, but I'll give you a sense of what the audit does. When you look at telecommunications and mobile coverage, we're very urbanised in Australia, and you know that. The growth, the 40% of growth will be in Sydney and Melbourne, which will carry that. But we need our food, our agricultural food, and there's a huge advancements in technological advancements in that are happening around the world. But you do need mobile coverage to access those technological advancements, and a high proportion of our rural and remote areas in Australia don't even have mobile coverage. So that's one of the things that the audit points out, that we have to take a broad view when we're looking at the infrastructure challenges ahead. One of the things just to note in conclusion is we are in the throes of a 3-month consultation period of the audit, and that's really important because legislatively we need to do the audit, and then from the audit we do the plan, and the plan is a blueprint of infrastructure reform coming ahead. So we're in a 3-month consultation period of the audit at the moment, and then we will take all those submissions on board as we develop the plan, which will be released in 2021. The audit also is informing an evidence base for the investment opportunities that will be in next year's infrastructure priority list. So we are seeing a much more breadth in the projects coming through in the infrastructure priority list for 2020. In releasing the 2019 audit, we are aiming to start a broader conversation about infrastructure investment and reform that will be best serve our growing communities. And it's a very real chance for you to have a say and help shape our thinking on how we as a country should respond to the challenges and opportunities ahead. And one final point that I'll make is collaboration is key, and with the importance of all the infrastructure bodies at the moment, we all work very closely together. And Jim called out the importance of Infrastructure Victoria and Michelle Masson and the team, and we as I-bodies do get together regularly and catch up, and we are developing a program of works that we can work together. So I think this period of collaboration while we're dealing with these infrastructure challenges is a great opportunity for us. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions following Sir Rod's speech.
So you've all heard the challenge. So that book you're halfway through reading, you've now got to abandon for the next 3 months. Immediately go home and start reading 640 pages, because you've got to then respond within the next 3 months. So get to it. I'm going to leave out half of Sir Rod's introduction because listening to him is much more interesting than listening to me. You already have the sense that he's been in the transport sector for virtually his whole working life. He's prepared significant transport reports for both the British governments and in Australia. At different times he's been CEO of Cathay Pacific, Ansett Airlines and British Airways. And as you have also heard, he was the founding chairman of Infrastructure Australia. There is literally no one better placed to provide us with an informed perspective of the transport sector's challenges and opportunities. Sir Rod said he's going to speak relatively briefly, so you get a chance to ask the question that you wish to. Over to Sir Rod Eddington,
Thanks, Michael.
AO.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll be very brief. We've had 2 pretty comprehensive presentations, and I want to give you as the audience a chance to talk about things you want to hear about. Just a couple of observations. I worked very closely with Jim when I did the East-West study here for the Victorian government, and have always felt that having people like him in the system's a great benefit to Australia. And I think it's really important that we continue to encourage that. I first came to know Monash in 1969, 50 years ago, when the transport excellence that is Monash University today was beginning. I was a young engineering student at UWA. My overwhelming memory of Monash in those days that it was home to the most famous student radical of the age, Albert Langer. I never did discover what happened to Albert, but he was pretty vigorous in those days. But let me just make a couple of points. The first is that as we reflect on the infrastructure needs of our nation, we need to be conscious that having done nothing for a long period of time, and Jim spoke about particularly the lack of investment in the rail infrastructure here in Victoria and particularly Melbourne over a long period of time. We're playing catch up to a large extent. But these big projects are expensive and disruptive. They are essential, but we shouldn't underestimate the challenges associated with delivering them. And many of the big projects in Australia at the moment nationally are over time and over budget. So there are some real challenges associated with delivering these projects. And given that both construction resource and finances are limited in any environment, then we need to make sure we prioritise what we're going to do and when we're going to do it. So the work that Romilly and her team nationally are doing, and the work that the eye bodies are doing around the states, I think is essential. We need to take an evidence-based approach to what makes the nation tick and what infrastructure projects are priority. And these aren't just what I would call hard infrastructure projects in the traditional areas of transport and electricity and water, but they're social infrastructure priorities as well around health and education particularly. The livability of the nation, in particular our cities, is really important. The cities are important because that's where 2/3 of Australians live, and we want to make sure they live in an environment that they enjoy being in. We need to think carefully about how we go about that. There is a real challenge at the moment, I think, in Australia in terms of finding the monies we need for these projects, and any construction company will tell you that there's a substantial shortfall of skilled trades, men and women, to deliver the projects. And I was in New Zealand a couple of weeks ago talking to the NACIAN Infrastructure Commission there that's just been set up. They're very focused on the fact that they don't have the skills they need. And one of the reasons is many of the skilled Kiwis are over here in Australia working on Australian projects. So alongside this question of what projects do we decide to do and how do we finance them, we need to think long and hard about how we train young men and women. I've got a view that we've undervalued technical skills, whether it's engineering at our universities, whether it's the technical skills in areas like plumbing, electricity, construction. These are vital to any successful economy. So I think we don't just need to think about what projects we run to, we need to think about how we train the next generation of people to deliver them and manage them. As I said at the beginning, I'm really keen to hear what you want to talk about. So I'm going to finish there and hand it over to you to talk about issues that are important to you. Michael, I think you're going to chair this, aren't you? Well done.
Now, we are tight for time, but we are very, very keen to hear from you. So here's what we'll do. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for us to get the microphone to you. If you would, state your name and the organisation you're from, if that is relevant. And most importantly, don't make a speech. We don't have time. Simply ask your question. So our man with the mic is over there. Who wants to ask a question? Down the very front here, if you could. Professor Graham Curry. You'd almost think I knew he was going to ask a question, wouldn't you?
He asks good questions.
Well, we'll see. Thanks very much for your presentation. It's excellent. Well, Jim raised some big issues there about not having plans but having projects. What does Infrastructure Australia think about that? Do you consider the context and the policy context for these? What's your frame of reference for projects?
Do you mean major infrastructure projects?
Yes, so the transport infrastructure project, she was arguing that there is no longer a plan. We get more project announcements than that don't have a plan behind them.
Right, okay. So we interestingly enough, have picked it up in our reform series. So I talked about the two levels of work we do, one being the assessment framework and business cases, and the second one being the reform series. And we very much call that out and support what Jim was saying about the importance of land use planning and infrastructure investment. And we released a report last year on livable cities and the importance of placemaking. So I very much support the fact that you also need to have the strategies and plans in place, and then looking at the projects that are picking that up. Because one of the things we point out is there's been some great examples of where there's been a disconnect between a project being done and there's a disconnect between then coming into a master plan community or something, and there has been unintended consequences because of that planning wasn't put in place or it didn't fit into the strategic roadmap. And Greater Sydney Commission is doing some really good work on that, and Jim also talked about that in looking at using the 3 tiers of governments to focus on that strategic planning view. So we're very much supportive of his view around the importance of planning,
A hand as
not
quick
just
as,
having the projects.
A hand as quick as you can. Who wants to ask a question? Yes, I've got a question here. As the question's being answered, if you want to ask a question, just give me a wave so I know where to direct the microphone without a gap.
Penelope Bennett, LXRP. Jim mentioned the need to reallocate road space and invest in active transport. You've just mentioned that as well. I suspect that you don't get many kind of big active transport projects coming into Infrastructure Australia. So how do we actually start investing those massive amounts of money that we could invest if we were going to do that seriously, and stop, I guess, talking the talk about livability and placemaking and actually, reflect that in the money that's invested?
So interestingly enough, in the current IPL we do have an active transport initiative in there from in Sydney. But interestingly enough, in the 200 projects that we currently have that we're reviewing, 10 are about active transport. So I think what we're seeing, because we've proactively gone out to the jurisdictions, and the audit is really calling it out. For those of you who have had the ability to look at it, we are calling out all these opportunities and saying that we need to take a broader view. And so I think you'll find that there is some shift in that, or we hope that there's a shift in that. The fact that I think we've got 10 that have come through is an excellent start. So the way we do it is we call it out. That's the whole aim of the audit. We're calling out these challenges, and we're really trying to work with the jurisdictions in bringing in those projects and initiatives. And if I don't answer the question that you want, or you want more detail, come and see me afterwards.
Hi, my question's for Romilly as well. I'm Sophia Dickinson from the Department of Transport Engagement Team. So I was really excited to hear you mention the importance of community engagement. And I just wondered, have you come across any good examples recently of projects that have had a better outcome because of really good community engagement?
So a really good one is, I know City of Melbourne have done a really good one, but I'll give you one that Brisbane City Council did. What's unique about Brisbane City Council, it is such a huge jurisdiction and that covers and picks up transport. What they did is they were developing their Brisbane strategy, and they did the normal stakeholder engagement that you see, 7 o'clock Wednesday night, no one can make it. And they didn't get much of an input from the community. They then overhauled their whole strategy using telecommunications, using technology, using postcards, using apps. They just looked at that. They wanted to get a view from all the different generations across who was living and working in Brisbane, and so they knew that they had to communicate with different generations in different ways. The older generation would want to have meetings or one-on-one conversations. The younger generation were going to use social media, or they would respond in using technology. Their response rate was eye-watering. It's something like 40% in Brisbane City Council catchment responded, and they really felt like that when they came out and said this is what they've said, they could actually say this is what they said. But they took a very broad approach, and I think that was a great example. I gave a speech on it recently, and I'm happy to share it with you, but we specifically call out that as a great way of engaging with the community. Don't assume that everyone has access to a computer or a phone. It's important that you get the views of all in an area that you're looking at, and the older generation all those that are disadvantaged will need to be communicated in other forms.
To both, but perhaps to you, Sir Rod. Bill Chandler, 25 years ago, Ken Ogden was brave enough to take on an architect town planner to do a master's, and he didn't actually have an honours degree, which scared the department. Not quite as much as when I then used loony cartoons to illustrate some of my points. But the question really is, I thought I was smart. I called it transport land use planning, the gulf between the rhetoric and the reality. It wasn't so smart after all, but I think the gulf between projects and strategic planning is still there enormously. We do not have a national settlement plan in Australia still. So how can we have a decent transport plan? How do you bridge between the projects and the strategic planning when one of the senior ministers doesn't realise that utopia is actually a documentary, not an entertainment?
I think you raised some really important issues. I think one of the challenges the Constitution, which I support entirely, but the brutal facts of life are most of the big projects are in the states, and the people who best understand what's necessary in the states are the people closest to the realities, and they're local councils and state governments. But most of the revenue is collected by the federal government. So that is a basic conundrum we've had since the Constitution was put in place. So the question is, who is best placed to do the national planning and who is best placed to do the state planning? Jim and I are in violent agreement on just about everything. We've worked together closely now for quite some time. But his point about land use planning and transport planning, infrastructure planning being one and the same is absolutely right. And I always start by saying, what are the physical and economic geography of the country, the state and the cities? And that's changed markedly since European settlement. We've gone from basically a rural agricultural economy into a services orientated city-centric economy, and a lot of our old infrastructure wasn't built with that in mind. So you've got to start with some really 30,000 feet questions about what we do. But unless you get the linkage between the physical and economic geographies right and the planning right for the nation, you're not going to get it right for the cities and states. And we see that in a number of other areas. But the other point is, whenever we think about projects, we often think about projects in isolation. And as Jim said, most of the infrastructure that we're going to be using in 40 years' time is already in place. So whenever we think about projects, we should think about the impact they have on networks. So if we think about a new piece of road or a new piece of rail, we should ask ourselves the question, what does this particular piece of the jigsaw do to liberating the network? Sometimes it's technology that can do that. But we need to think about the network consequences. Making better use of existing networks is really, really important. Whereas it's projects that tend to be the bright, shiny pin. And as Jim said, and I'm right with him, politicians get a kick out of cutting a ribbon on a new piece of project. They don't get a kick out of cutting the ribbon on a refurbished railway station or a stretch of motorway which liberates the rest of the network, and I think that's a real challenge for us.
And I'll just pick up one point. Interestingly enough, the Sydney Morning Herald did a population summit yesterday, and Jim's boss, Rob Stokes, who actually happens to be my local member, called out for a settlement strategy. And the other thing so that's in the Sydney Morning Herald today if you want to, or download Rob's speech. And the other thing that New South Wales did 3 years ago, I think, they released Greater Sydney Commission, the infrastructure strategy and the land use strategy were all released at the same time. And they made the decision, and they were making a point, and they felt that was incredibly important, that it was done all together.
And this will be...
Would that have happened if Jim wasn't there? I'm not sure it would have.
This will be our last question, so I'm sure it's going to be a beauty.
I certainly hope so. Graham McCabe from Mervis. Our road infrastructure is incredibly inefficient in terms of value of goods moved and number of people. do you think in your lifetime we'll realistically get road pricing?
I wrote a report for the British government in 2006 about the links between transport and the economy. And one of my firm recommendations was road pricing, the introduction of a more viable road pricing scheme. Particularly as the technology's got better, it's much easier to do it. The number plate recognition system that drives the congestion charging in the UK is a perfectly decent system, but it's very expensive to run in the context of the monies you collect. Because if you can collect money and get net large numbers, you can reinvest that in transport of all types, including public transport. And so that was one of my firm recommendations, and the Royal Automobile Association in the UK then ran a petition which 1 million people signed saying that I should be executed in the public square and that road pricing was a terrible idea. Now that's 2006. I think the good news is that there's an increasing awareness that you can't build your way out of trouble, particularly in the road space, and that you need some form of demand management mechanism to counterbalance the growth. But in order to do that, so I'm for road pricing, but if you're going to price people off roads, you need to provide them with some strong public transport alternatives. And in cities, that's usually, in my experience, heavy rail. And increasingly, if the cities are going to work properly, that means underground. So one of the points I've made now for a long time is that what we have in Melbourne, for example, is a suburban rail network that was built around bringing people from the suburbs to the inner city where most of the big jobs were. But that as the city got bigger and as we saw more and more people moving to living in the cities, not just working there, we needed to start to build an urban rail network to complement the suburban rail network. And that's what all the big cities have done. I mean, London began that journey 150 years ago with the underground. I saw it built in Hong Kong. I lived in Tokyo, in Seoul. All of these cities reach a stage about where Melbourne is now, where we need a strong urban rail network to supplement and complement the suburban rail network. So one of my recommendations in the East-West study I did for the Bracks and Brumby government was that we begin the building of what is now a metro. And that will not be, or shouldn't be, one rail line. Metros are networks. I mean, if you're in Tokyo or Hong Kong or London, the underground network is what makes the city live and allows people to get around without having to jump in and out of a car. So this is a long journey, but road pricing is a fundamental part of the mix. And sooner or later, we're going to have to do it.
Infrastructure Australia would support that view because when you look at analysis of electric and automated vehicles, by 2040, 40% of our road could be electric vehicles, and so there's going to be this tension coming financially for government around road user charging and the decreasing money, revenue which they're getting. So Infrastructure Australia is very supportive of reforming this. The other point I'd make that Sir Rod just raised is there's an addendum to the audit called the Urban Transport Crowding and Congestion Report. And the reason it's really important is this. We do a lot of focus on congestion, and we keep saying road congestion, and the issue around productivity. But what we found in our report is we have terrible transport crowding as well. And so we have to take into account when we're doing our transport planning that we actually need to uplift the amount of light rail, that if we're trying to push people, buses, if we're trying to push them off the roads into transport, we also need to ensure that we're continuing to focus on public transport because all we're doing is pushing them off one problem onto another, and that has their own, and I'm sure a number of you have dealt with that. I catch the B line in the Northern Beaches, and standing on a bus for an hour and 10 minutes is not fun. And so it's really important that we look at the challenge of both congestion and crowding together.
I'm sure this is a conversation that could go on for quite some time, and with all events, we've got to draw a line somewhere. Our panel members will be around for a while tonight, so there is an opportunity to continue the conversation with them. But at this stage, I'd like to invite the person that started this 50 years ago, Dr. Ken Ogden, to come up and give a vote of thanks for our speakers.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and ladies and gentlemen, panel. I'm very pleased to be invited to move a vote of thanks. I think we've been very privileged tonight, and the full room is testimony to that. In fact, we've gone 21 minutes over so far with a couple of minutes to go as testimony to what a really great night we've had. The panel, as it says on the screen, was asked to consider the transport challenges and opportunities looking back and looking forward. And they did so, each from their own particular background. Sir Rod Eddington brought a perspective from business and internationally. Romilly Madu brought a perspective on transport infrastructure in the context of infrastructure more broadly, and defined infrastructure more broadly than just fixed infrastructure, cultural infrastructure and social infrastructure as well. And Jim Betts, well, he described himself as a Mandarin, so I won't expand on that. I'm guessing most of us here tonight are professionals, and I hear fellow professionals sometimes lamenting the fact that transport decisions are too political. Well, at the end of the day, if you're spending public money, that's the role of the elected official. So inherently, transport decisions have to be political. The best we can hope for is that they're good decisions. And to be good decisions, you would hope that they are coming from well-informed, evidence-based people. And what we've seen tonight, and what reassures me, is that there are people in the community, such as the three that we've heard from, who are willing and able to provide that independent, evidence-based advice to inform good decision-making. We've had a lot of interesting and stimulating challenges put before us tonight, and I'm sure each and every one of us will have something that we've taken away and will take away and will use. Could I just make a couple of comments about two or three things that particularly struck me? Firstly, it struck me that, and a few of the speakers and questions mentioned this, that there is in fact a lot of continuity, or if you like, robustness or resilience in the transport system. A couple of people made the point that most of the transport network we use today was in place 50 years ago. Most of the transport network that, well, some of you, not me, but some of you, and our kids and grandkids will use in 50 years is in place now. Romilly also made the point in relation to that what we do as we make those changes must be done well. There's also a continuity in the essential demand for transport service. Jim Betts made, I think, a terribly important and quite fundamental point that transport is not an end in itself. But people will still need to use the mobility and the access the transport system provides. Goods still need to be moved. Emergency services and tradies still need to get to where they're needed. There's an inherent stability in that in that underlying need for transport and the demand that it generates. I think there's also some continuity in the issues that need to get resolved, and it's interesting that the integration or the marrying of transport and land use came up more than once. It was something we were struggling with 50 years ago, and while we've heard a lot of reassuring words, I think we're still struggling to really integrate transport planning, land use planning and economic planning. We recognise the importance of it. I think we've still got a way to go. So some things don't change, but on the other hand, some things do change over time. Institutional structures change. I was reflecting in preparing this that there's not a single institution that I can think of that's been in place 50 years ago that is still with us. The functions are still there, but the institutional structure has changed. The way government agencies are structured, the role of different levels of government, the role of the private sector, sources of funding, these are the things that are changing and will continue to change. And similarly, the underlying community values that affect the political imperative do change. We heard questions about green transport, we heard comments about community involvement, and these are all very, very important. Technology, I expected technology would get more of a run tonight. It was hinted at, and I'm sure if we went another half hour, we'd have spent a lot of time talking about technology. But technology is changing, will change, and that will create challenges and opportunities. Sir Rod made the very important point about coming to grips with how to deliver projects. Where's the funding coming from? Where's the skills coming from? How do we accommodate the disruption that major projects cause? And again, if I come back to the point I made, where we can take reassurance is that on issues like these, as they emerge, there are people like the three people on tonight's panel who can bring their wisdom and insight to bear and can provide valuable, informed and relevant advice. And again, I say we've been very privileged to hear from them. Jeff gave me 5 minutes, and I'm sure that's up. But before I ask you to thank the panel, I'm going to take a couple of minutes more, because there was, of course, a fourth speaker tonight, and that was Jeff himself. Jeff briefly summarised the last 50 years of the Transport Group. He said it's unique in the world, and that's not an understatement. It's a very unique organisation with a great history. 50 years is a long time. I remember reading somewhere that there are not many organisations that last for a long time, but those that do have got one thing in common, and that is they have a clear sense of purpose. So what's the sense of purpose of the Transport Group? Well, of course, we start, as Jeff did, with a classic academic rationale of excellence in scholarship and teaching and research. We can tick that off. We can also look at the people. I won't name names, but if you look at many of the people who are occupying important positions in the transport sector today in Australia and around the world, whether in government, industry, academia, consulting, the seeds of their interest in transport were perhaps sown as students at Monash. And I think that's something that we can easily overlook, but is terribly important. But I think there's more. In a field of study that's so exposed to public scrutiny and where every commuter is a transport expert, I think we need to add words like relevance, inquiry, partnerships, engagement, leadership, or as Jeff put it, putting back into the community. And that's where these lectures, I think, are so very valuable. Personally, I feel greatly honoured and very humbled that the university has seen fit to title these events the Ogden Lecture, because they serve to keep to the forefront the extremely valuable role that universities can and do, and I think must play, in stimulating public discussion, raising issues of urgent concern. And Jeff, I think you and your colleagues must have been very chuffed to hear particularly the very favourable comments that Jim made about the role that the Transport Group has played in Victoria over the years. So can I say to you, Jeff, and to your colleagues, keep up the good work, continue to be a burr under the saddle where you can, and keep up the good work. Ladies and gentlemen, would you join me in thanking our panel, Sir Rod Eddington, Romilly Maju, Jim Betts, but also Michael Kennedy and Jeff Rose.
After a 50-year journey, it's an appropriate time to go outside and have a drink and something to eat and celebrate. I would like to just say in closing, a very big thanks to Michael Kennedy, to Brenda O'Keefe and to Luke Valenza, who played an instrumental role in helping us to get tonight off the ground, to our other helpers, and also to Samantha Cofield, who's up the back, and the TAC for the help that you provided with access to facilities here. Please, everyone, come outside and celebrate with us for the first 50 years of the group at Monash. Thank you and good night.